All right, welcome to the lecture Tips for Writing a Philosophy Paper. Actually, I compiled this list of 8 tips for writing a paper way back in 2008 when I was teaching a class in Southern California, but I found that these tips are actually quite useful in helping students get a sense of what I'm expecting in a philosophy paper and really what makes a good philosophy paper. So the aim of this lecture is to go through these 8 tips one by one, hopefully by the end you have a sense of what will make a good argumentative philosophy paper. All right, let's move on. So the first tip I've labeled Convince the Skeptical. Okay, so a philosophical paper is a persuasive paper or an argumentative paper in which you'll be stating a thesis in the introduction, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then you're going to be providing arguments, which consist of reasons, examples, statistics, analogies, and so forth to support and defend this thesis. One of the things I tell my students in face-to-face classes is that when you're compiling your essay or when you're writing an outline, imagine that you're addressing this critic or the skeptic of your view, somebody who disagrees with your thesis, and that your challenge or your aim in writing the paper is to try to persuade the skeptic that your position is correct. Now, of course, you may not ultimately succeed. There are some folks who are just so steadfast in their views that they're not going to change their mind. But at the very least, what you want to do is try to demonstrate to the critic or the skeptic the reasonability or the force of your argument, so that at the end of the day, even though he might say, I don't agree with you, I at least understand your side and the arguments for your side of the issue. The second tip I've labeled, Why Should I Care? And this tip relates to writing a good introductory paragraph. Okay, here's an example of an introductory paragraph that was from an essay about the Virginia Tech shooting, which occurred, I believe, in 2007. You probably remember this terrible event that was all over the news in 2007. Here's the paragraph. It reads, The Virginia Tech massacre has reignited the debate over whether owning guns should be made illegal in the United States. Though many point to the recent massacre as an obvious reason why guns have no place in the streets, others, such as the National Rifle Association, argue that owning a gun is a basic right found in the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution. Throughout the decades, this enduring and often heated debate has dominated the airwaves and television sets. This paper will argue that guns should be kept legal in the United States. Okay, so this is a very, very well-written introductory paragraph to an essay on gun control. And I want you just to take a moment, just examine this paragraph and think about 2 or 3 things that make this paragraph, this introductory paragraph, effective. And I'll just give you a moment to think about that, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, one of the things you probably noticed in the previous slide, in the previous paragraph, right off of the bat, the author captures the reader's attention. Right off of the bat, he addresses this question, why the reader should care. Now, if you want to think of it this way, think about how the reader, right after reading your introductory paragraph, he has a choice whether to continue reading the remainder of the essay or to put it aside. Now, of course, in my case, since I'm grading your essay, I have to read the entire thing regardless of how dull or how brilliant the introductory paragraph is. But essentially what you want to do is to show why the reader should continue on reading. And one of the ways to do this, and perhaps the most effective way to do this, is to show how the debate is relevant and then to summarize just very, very briefly the different sides of the debate. So you might say, these people over here say this, these people over there say that, just to show the divisiveness and to show the heatedness of the debate, to show that people are disagreeing. And once you do that, then this is where you state your thesis. You say, well, these people have said this, those people over there have said this, this is where I come in. This is my original contribution to the conversation. This is what I think in light of what everybody else has said. Your introductory paragraph must state your thesis. It must state your position on the issue. Okay, finally, the previous paragraph did not do this, but I highly encourage you, after you state your thesis, to just give, in a sentence or two, a brief roadmap or plan for your paper. Tell the reader where you're going. Tell the reader how you're going to argue for your thesis. Just summarize very, very briefly, no more than 3 sentences, just your the major points that you're going to hit upon. So just to reiterate what was said on the previous slide, this time, however, we revisit our example of the introductory paragraph. Very early on in this introductory paragraph, the author explains very briefly the different sides of the issue. So on one side you have those who think that guns should be banned. On the other side you have the NRA, who argues that that ownership of guns is a basic right, and then shortly thereafter the introductory paragraph states its thesis that situates the paper or situates the argument into the conversation. It shows how the paper will contribute to the ongoing, enduring, and often heated debate about gun control. The only thing that this paragraph is missing is the roadmap, which I talked about earlier. It would have been good if the paper gave, maybe in just 2 or 3 sentences, a very brief overview of how the paper will go about arguing for this thesis. Okay, the third tip I've labeled, somewhat unwillingly, avoid promiscuous paragraphs. Promiscuity being defined, of course, as having many partners, which is in contrast with monogamy, which means being faithful to only one partner. So you're probably wondering what exactly is meant by avoid promiscuous paragraphs. And just a little bit of background, after reading so many essays, I found that many students oftentimes write really, really long paragraphs that are dedicated to more than one point. But I should say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that it offends my philosophical sensibilities to have a paragraph dedicated to more than one point, i.e. a promiscuous paragraph. Rather, each paragraph should be dedicated to or faithful to one and only one point. If you want to discuss a different idea or point, start a new paragraph. So let's take an example from the same essay about gun control. And let's just go ahead and read through this paragraph. Contrary to our intuitions, having more guns on the street will deter more crime than prevent it. Criminals will think twice before breaking into a home, given that there is a good possibility that residents of the house will own a gun. Also, even if guns were banned in the United States, they would simply make their way into the country from across the border. In addition, the Second Amendment says that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And we, as good Americans, must stay true to the Bill of Rights. Alright, paradigm example of a promiscuous paragraph. You see that this paragraph is dedicated to 3 different points. The first part is dedicated to how having more guns on the street will prevent more crime. In the red, you have the second point, which talks about how guns will make their way into the country anyway, even if they are banned. And then finally, you have a third point in the same paragraph about how our Second Amendment says that we have a right to bear arms. Okay, now all 3 of these points are very, very good points that can contribute to the author's overall thesis that the right to own a gun should be upheld. However, each of these 3 points belong in separate paragraphs. Okay, this leads us directly into tip 4, ideas, growth, and development. And this tip directly falls out of, or comes from, the previous tip, avoid promiscuous paragraphs. Over the years, in reading many essays, one of the things that I found with students who write promiscuous paragraphs is that they're less likely to develop their ideas in full detail. In the previous example of the promiscuous paragraph, you had 3 points, but you probably noticed that those 3 points were not developed in any detail. In fact, there are only 2 or 3 sentences dedicated to each point. but you want to develop your points in full detail. You want to go in great depth. And I think what will help you do this is, once again, going back to tip 3, dedicating a separate paragraph or two to each major point. Okay, so what I've done here is I have taken a major point made in the previous example paragraph, the promiscuous paragraph, and I've developed it in some detail. So this is the point about how the guns will make their way into the country anyway, even if they were banned. And then the rest of the paragraph goes into great detail developing this point. In fact, it would create a black market for guns, the author writes, rewarding mob bosses, crime syndicates, and rogue countries. Allow me to give an example. During the 1920s, the United States made the sale and consumption of alcohol illegal. As a result of this, a black market was created during the Prohibition era. Mob bosses such as Al Capone made fortunes, thus increasing the problem of organized crime in the 1930s. All in all, alcohol consumption did not go down due to its prohibition. Okay, so you can see how whereas the previous promiscuous paragraph, it only dedicated maybe 1 or 2 sentences to developing this point. This paragraph goes into quite a bit of detail, and overall this paragraph is a very, very good, well-developed and persuasive paragraph that develops and brings out in detail one of the major points that the author makes in favor of his thesis. Tip 5, your opinion throughout, not simply here and there. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because many of you probably already realize this, but this tip was inserted in response to the many, many papers I received in which the student would write an entire 5-page paper, and only in the conclusion would he or she insert his opinion. So the student may write, in conclusion, my view on the death penalty is this, or in conclusion, my view on gun control is this. But actually, as you probably already know, your entire essay is development and arguing your opinion, where your opinion is stated at the very beginning, right, which is your thesis statement, and then the rest of the essay is dedicated to tactfully and methodically developing and arguing your opinion. Tip 6, always for the sake of, and never just because. And this point speaks to the truth that every, and underline every paragraph and every sentence in your body paragraph should be for the sake of supporting either directly or indirectly your thesis. Paragraphs and sentences in your body paragraphs that do not support the thesis are in the paper just because they are superfluous paragraphs, otherwise known as paragraphs or sentences that are there in order to help the student fulfill the 5-page minimum requirement. So take a look at this paragraph and imagine that this paragraph was inserted into the paper where the author is arguing for the right to own a gun. Here, this paragraph is essentially expressing or detailing the difference between Democrats and Republicans on gun control law. It says that more Democrats than Republicans support gun control laws, and that more Republicans own guns in their homes than Democrats. Alright, so even though this is related to the overall topic of gun control, it does nothing to actually contribute to the overall argument of the paper. It does nothing to support the thesis that the right to own guns should be protected. And as such, it is a paragraph that is there just because it's a superfluous paragraph and it is unnecessary in the overall essay. Tip 7, avoid tunnel vision. Okay, this tip reflects the point that regardless of what you're writing on, whether it's the existence of God, whether it's the morality of the death penalty, whether it's the morality of gun control, philosophical and ethical issues are not black and white, and I hope that's one thing that you've come to understand in thinking about your paper. Rather, these are issues in which reasonable, intelligent people with PhDs have and still do disagree. Right? That's why we need to avoid tunnel vision. Now, what does that mean for you when writing your paper? Now you probably noticed in the essay prompt that I'm making you lay out an objection towards the end and then respond to this objection to your view. And at this point, many students come to me with questions and ask why they need to do this. Why do we need to lay out an objection? The question goes, doesn't laying out an objection and responding to the objection simply weaken our argument for our overall thesis? And the answer actually is quite the contrary. Now, we already mentioned how these issues are not black and white, right? They're issues over which reasonable, intelligent people can disagree. And essentially, laying out an objection shows that you're sensitive to the fact that this debate is complex, and you're sensitive to the fact that other people may have valid points, even though at the end of the day you think that these valid points are insufficient. So what you're essentially doing is you're illustrating sensitive, nuanced, and mature thinking and acknowledging that there is another side to the issue that is worthy of being addressed. Now, I should say that when you're laying out the objection, make sure that you lay out the objection in the best possible light. What you don't want to do is create a straw man out of the other person's argument. So maybe take an entire paragraph to try to explain the objection in as much detail and as much accuracy as possible. And then once you've done that, then respond to the objection. Again, what you're doing here is you're saying, well, look, there is a different side to this issue. Here's why my side is better. The great 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill actually has a brilliant quote that I wholeheartedly agree with about avoiding tunnel vision. Mill says, "He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. If he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposing side, if he does not so much know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion." And I'll let that quote stand on its own. So tip 8, write an outline. So there's a heavy emphasis on philosophical writing of organization of thought. The argument should be tight, it should be concise, and it should be organized as well. Now, the bad news is that just by our nature, our thoughts are not structured. They're not organized. So if I were to sit down the night before and just write the paper, a free association paper, I probably will have an essay that is highly disorganized or scattered. So that said, I highly encourage you to write an outline. Plan your essay before you actually write it. So here's a basic outline of a typical philosophical paper. Of course, you could deviate from this a little bit, especially when it comes to the major points. I've had some students write very good papers that just go into one major point in great detail, and I've had other students write good papers that have gone into more than 3 points. But essentially what you have is your introduction, where you introduce the issue, you state your thesis, and then you give a brief roadmap of how you're going to argue for your thesis. Then in the body part, you introduce your first major point, argue for that. Your second major point, argue for that. Third major point, argue for that. Then you'll get into the section of objection and response. State the objection. Remember, state it in all its detail. Maybe dedicate a paragraph or two just laying out what the objection might be, and then respond to this objection to your best of your ability. And finally, in your conclusion, just restate your thesis, wrap up, kind of summarize what you did in the essay, and then conclude the essay. All right. I was going to say something, but I don't remember. Okay, we could go ahead and move on then. Okay, call me crazy, but one of the things that I've always done is actually provide a diagram of my argument as an outline. Here I have my thesis, and then I brainstormed 3 or 4 major points that will be used in support of my thesis. Here I have guns help deter crime, banning guns won't eliminate guns, and we have a right to own a gun as specified by the Second Amendment of the Constitution. So these are my 3 major points. Maybe you could call them major premises that converge onto my conclusion that guns should be kept legal. And then I brainstorm some points that can support my major points here. And doing this, at least for me, helps me organize the overall structure of my essay in my head. And once I have the diagram of the argument, then I could go into detail and filling in the details here with all these statistics and examples and such that help support my major points. All right, moving on. Okay, just to wrap up what we've said. Tip 1, your aim is to convince the skeptical. You want to argue your view, pretending that you are addressing somebody who is skeptical of your own view. Tip 2, why should I care? So this speaks to your introduction. Your introduction should be catchy. It should show the reader why they should continue reading on. It should state your thesis or your position on the issue, and it should give a little roadmap as to how your paper will argue for your thesis. Tip 3, avoid promiscuous paragraphs. Make sure that all your paragraphs are faithful to one and only one point. Avoid those paragraphs that are dedicated to 2 or more points, because paragraphs dedicated to 1 point will help you and give you more motivation to develop your points and ideas in great detail. Make sure that all of your points and ideas are developed to their full extent. Tip 5, your opinion throughout. So your entire essay is dedicated to supporting your thesis. Don't just state your opinion in the conclusion of the essay. Tip 6, always for the sake of, never just because. So each paragraph, each body paragraph, and each sentence in the body paragraph should be for the sake of, either directly or indirectly supporting your thesis on the issue. Tip 7, avoid tunnel vision. So always make sure that you address an objection. Lay out the objection in its most detailed light in a paragraph or two, and then dedicate a paragraph or two to responding to the objection. Doing so shows that you are a nuanced, sensitive, and mature thinker, and you recognize that the issue is complex and reasonable people can disagree. And then finally, tip 8, write an outline. Write an outline, perhaps write a diagram of your argument. Plan your argument before you actually write it. All right, well, thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you later.